Welcome to the fifth season podcast, Conversations on Successful Aging. I'm David Lowry, and I'm joined with my friend and co host Don Drew. We believe that aging is a privilege, so we want to have conversations on how to do it well. Don, how are you?
Doing great, David. And you know what? We've been on quite a journey these last few weeks. Producer identities, that part of us when we're younger says we have to produce and make things, create and earn money and all that. Then last week we got into quieting the mental noise that keeps us from our own wisdom. But today I want to get into something that I think connects to both of these conversations in a really interesting way.
You're right, Don. And what we're going to talk about today is something I think everybody over 50 has experienced, at least, well, I have anyway. And it's this cycle of where our health becomes something we react to rather than something we tend. One of my friends said one time, as you get older, parts start falling off. Well, I don't want to make it sound that desperate, but I will say that when things start happening to us, we find ourselves in reaction mode rather than what should we be doing. So I think it's directly tied to that same intensity-driven, production-oriented mindset that we've been talking about the last couple of weeks.
I really get that. I have the same issues I think most people do once they cross around the 60 threshold. Those things just start breaking, right? So here's a question I'd like us to sit with today. What if the way most of us approach our health as we get older is actually the wrong approach entirely? Not wrong in terms of the choices we make, because sometimes we just have to react to things, right? But wrong in terms of the rhythm and relationship we have with those choices.
And I think it's perfectly understandable because in our younger years, we could just react. Something happened and we just go to the doctor and fix it. But today, we're going to have to learn a new way. We're going to have to look at some fascinating research, including work being done right now about the biology of aging, and discuss what scientists mean when they use the words health span. That's a term that people don't use so often, health span. And we're going to get practical about what consistency first approach to health actually looks like in our daily lives. Let's start by naming a pattern, an intensity trap. It's an intensity trap. And Don, I'll ask you, have you ever had one of those moments maybe after a doctor's appointment or maybe a health scare or just looking in the mirror and you go, whoa, who is that person? And you suddenly decide, this is it. Everything's got to change.
Times than I'd like to admit, David. I think it's interesting that it almost always comes from a real place of genuine concern, right? I mean, we see something doesn't look right or something doesn't feel right, and we feel concerned about our bodies and about what's going on. Last year, I had rotator cuff surgery. It was because the pain that I had become unbearable. I actually injured it originally when I was about 20 years old. I had re-injured it many times over the years, and I had put up with the pain. It had just become regular. I'd accepted it. But as I was getting older, it was just getting worse and worse until finally one day I was playing pickleball. I hit up against the wall. That did it. But there's something about the way that motivation shows up that sets us up to fail almost from the beginning, meaning, I waited a very long time to do that. And there wasn't to have the surgery. And it really set me up in some ways for potential failure.
I identify with that. I was at my 6-month checkup the other day and I was talking about a pain, and she looked on my chart and noted that 5 years ago I'd still been talking about that pain. And I actually it's like, okay, that's not how you're supposed to take care of stuff, right? And there's actually a name for this cycle in behavioral health research, and it's sometimes called the reactive health model. So sometimes as we age, we tend to fall into it more deeply, not less. And here's how it works. Something triggers a concern. It could be like a diagnosis, a number on a scale, like maybe your ANC or something like that. A moment of breathlessness climbing the stairs, or maybe a friend you have has a heart attack or something. And then all that concern produces this burst of intense action. It's like, well, I don't want to let that happen to me. You do the diet overhaul, or you sign up for the gym, or you order every supplement that you see on social media. And you decide, I'm going to wake up at 5 in the morning and I'm just going to, jog up and down the street. And that's not really what you need to be doing, Don, is it?
Yeah, I mean, psychologically for a while it works. So maybe even physiologically, it helps, all right? At least it feels like it's working. Until at some point it just doesn't, right? I mean, we give up either give up the gym, or we give up running, or we give up whatever. And then we move on to the next crisis.
Sure. And we had this dopamine or neurocognitive reward, neurochemical reward in our brain when we do things like that. It's sort of like, hey, I'm doing something and I'm changing the equation in my life. But the aging body doesn't really respond to doing things really intensely like it once did. If you think you're going to put on muscle the way you did when you were in your 20s and 30s, forget it. The recovery windows are longer, your hormones are not the same as they were, and the psychological cost after failing after an intense effort is a little bit higher when we're older because our identities become wrapped up in what we used to be. And it's sort of sad sometimes, Don. And I feel this most intensely sometimes if I'm not careful when I go to, I've been doing yoga for years. And sometimes in my yoga studio, we'll do something I could easily do years ago. And it's either a struggle or I just have to check out of it when it's going on. So we sometimes compare ourselves to the glory days, as it were.
Yeah, I still tend to push myself pretty hard at times, but now my body pushes back, right? And when that happens too much or too hard, I tend to feel defeated, right? And I tend to retreat entirely. In fact, I've been confessing lately that in many of our podcasts over the last several years, I've talked about the importance of walking, hiking, and so on. But what I found was, and I've talked about doing daily walks, but what I found is over the last year, I had a lot of things happen. We moved houses and so forth, and I kind of got away from that because walking at times was difficult and so on. So I retreated entirely. And then, I just sit back and wait for something to happen again. And what happens after a while is we start to give up on these things and it's self-defeating.
I really identify with that. I was talking to my wife about I want to lose some weight, let's say, and that's true, I do. And at first I thought and then I said, but I don't really want to diet. And she says, well, that's not how you lose weight anyway. It's consistent effort as opposed to just hitting the crash plan and knocking it all off in the summertime or something like that. This waiting period that you're talking about where you wait for the next trigger is where the real damage happens. It's not just physically, but in our relationship with our own health. We see our health as something out there to be conquered rather than something inside that we tend. And that's the key point I hope that people won't miss. We're not out here to conquer something. We're out here to tend what's on the inside.
Yeah, and for males in particular, I think there's something about the masculine experience of aging that really amplifies what you're talking about. Okay. So for a lot of men in our generation, health was never really a daily conversation. You just worked hard, stayed busy, and dealt with things when they broke. And the body was kind of more like a tool than a garden that needed to be tended to.
That's a really powerful distinction, Don. A tool versus a garden. And I think that framing is actually the heart of what we're really exploring today because the science of aging is increasingly telling us that the garden metaphor isn't just poetic and sweet sounding. It's actually fairly biologically accurate. And when we get into the research, one of the things that we're going to find more in our health vocabulary, if you haven't heard it already, is this notion of Healthspan.
You mentioned that really at the start of the podcast, and I think all of us are familiar with the term lifespan, the number of years we're alive, right? So I've seen a lot of different numbers, but typically say for, I think males, average lifespan is about 83 years, something like that, and women's 85, 86. How long we tend to live. But you and I were introduced to a new concept when we had Dr. Benjamin Miller on our Peaceful Life radio podcast last year. He introduced us to this concept of health span, and it's something different, isn't it?
It really was, and it was very eye-opening to me at the time and still is because he was working on health span, the number of years we live in good health. Actually, science can extend the number of years you live, but the real question is, are you living them in a healthy way? Is it good to be alive in those last years, or are you just, suffering immeasurably for it? So Dr. Miller really kind of opened our eyes about the idea of the notion of not just adding years to your life, but life to your years.
It's interesting that when Dr. Miller was talking about lifespan and health span, he made the point that his work really isn't intended to extend the length of life. It's to narrow the gap between bad health and death, frankly. And in other words, to give us a healthier time while we're alive and a shorter time of decline. And so this gap between lifespan and health span becomes something that really should get all of our attention.
It really should. And the concept, though, of having, I mean, let's ask, would you rather just live a long time and spend, say, maybe a decade of it in just miserable health, or would you rather live really healthy right up until the last minute and then go? And it's a sobering reality to think about because the average American today can expect to spend roughly the last 10 to 15 years of their life in a state of declining health, managing these chronic conditions, losing mobility, experiencing cognitive decline. We've gotten very good at keeping you alive, but we haven't gotten near as good about keeping people well.
Right. That's exactly where the science gets interesting because the question researchers are now asking isn't just how do we live longer, it's how do we compress that period of decline? How do we extend the years of vitality and push the period of serious decline as close to the end of life as possible? At least that's the goal.
Yeah, actually, there's a term for that too. It's called I love this, the compression of morbidity. It's
That's kind of ominous, doesn't it?
It is kind of ominous. It's a concept introduced by Dr. James Fries, not French fries, but James Fries back in the 1980s. It's the idea that we don't have to accept a long, slow decline, that with the right interventions and critically the right consistency of behavior, there's that word consistency again, we can live well right up until the end.
And this is where the research on biology of aging becomes so relevant to our conversation about intensity versus consistency. Because what the science is showing us is that the levers that extend health span are almost exclusively consistent dependent, not intensity dependent. And that's really the opposite of what we hear mostly about exercise, right?
Right, consistency dependent. Doing it day in and day out or with regularity. It's not the dramatic interventions. Oh, I'm going to go on this diet and just, biohack myself with, some sort of new supplement or something like that. It's the daily, and it's sort of undramatic. It's not really very sexy sounding, but it's and maybe the boring practices such as paying attention to your sleep, notice your movement, connection, stress management, and nutrition, all consistently done over time, that will move the needle on your health span.
David, let's stay here with the science because I think this is really where the conversation gets grounded. You've been looking at some research coming out of the aging and health longevity space, specifically work done by Dr. Benjamin Miller, who we mentioned earlier. Tell us about that.
Yes, I have. And it's really exciting work. Dr. Miller is a researcher at the Oklahoma Medical Research Foundation. So it's a, very prestigious place. And he's one of the leading scientists studying what is called the biology of aging, and it's done at a cellular level. So he gets right down to the cells. And his lab focuses specifically on cells and how they age, how they stop functioning properly, and critically, what you can do or what interventions can slow or maybe even reverse these processes.
Now, when you talk about biology of aging, David, help people understand what we're actually talking about because I think most of us have a pretty surface level understanding of what aging is biologically.
Sure. Here's a simplified but accurate picture. Our cells have built-in aging processes. One of the most studied is what happens to our mitochondria. These are the energy modules are the engines that are energetic in our cells. And as we age, mitochondria become less efficient and they produce more damaging byproducts called the free radicals. And then they begin to decline. And the result is that our cells, tissues, and organs have less energy and less resilience.
And then this shows up in some really practical ways as fatigue. When I say practical, I mean common ways. Fatigue, slower recovery. Those of us that are older know it takes us longer to recover from injuries and so on than it once did. Things like reduced muscle mass, sometimes cognitive fog. All of these things we tend to attribute to just getting older, but that's not necessarily, it is part of getting older, but there is a biological piece to this.
Dr. Miller's work becomes really relevant in this conversation because it's formed because he's focused on exercise as a biological intervention. So that's something to think about. When you exercise, it's biological intervention, not just exercising as a way to burn calories or maybe even build muscles, but to signal all of the cells within you that it's time to renew, repair, maintain their function. That's really interesting to me.
I think he's indicating that exercise in a very real way is actually communicating with our cells.
It's cellular communication. And as a communication professor, I have a new area of study now, Don, cellular communication, right? In a very real, measurable way, when we exercise, even just moderately, we trigger a cascade of cellular repair processes. So, Don, when you go out and walk and take those hikes, and when I do my yoga twice a week, or we go to the gym and do light weights or whatever it is we do, we're signaling the body's process of clearing out the old damaged mitochondria to replace them with new and healthy ones. And Miller's research has looked at how exercise frequency and consistency will drive the process.
I imagine the findings connect directly to what we've been saying about consistency over intensity. Isn't it true that, and I've heard this from multiple sources we've looked at, that even modest amounts of exercise are better than nothing? So if we are doing intense exercise, but it's causing us to hurt or to quit exercising, then we're actually hurting ourselves in the process.
Sure. It's something that some people have learned about walking versus running even, is that if you really want to burn fat off of your body, sometimes it's the long, slow walks over a distance done consistently and regularly that will do you the best. And so when it comes to exercise at our age, it's the duration and frequency of just consistency done, 30 minutes, 5 days a week, which gives you the cellular benefit that you really want over time. And it's more important than just having those big bursts of energy saying, I'm just going to tear up the gym today, and then next week maybe I'll do it again. It's just focus and consistency, Don.
Yeah, the consistency gives the cells that regular signal, tells them that they know now that they're in an environment that they're living in, and that this environment demands function.
That's a really beautiful way to put it, Don. And Miller's work extends just beyond mitochondria. His lab has also investigated cellular senescence, what some researchers call zombie cells. And these are cells that have stopped dividing and functioning normally, but they really haven't died yet. They just stick around and release all this inflammatory stuff into your system, and that actually damages the healthy surrounding tissue.
Another ominous sounding phrase, David, senescent cells.
Senescent cells, your zombie cells. And it's a driver of the aging process. And the accumulation of these senescent cells is associated with very much, almost every age-related element that we know about. And these include heart disease, diabetes, cognitive decline, even cancer. But the good news is that consistent lifestyle behaviors such as regular, moderate exercise, quality sleep, anti-inflammation nutrition, all of these appear to reduce this senescent cells over time.
So when we skip the workout, skip the sleep, eat poorly for a stretch, we're not just having a bad week, we're potentially allowing more of these we're potentially allowing more of these cellular changes to accumulate.
Conversely, when we return to these behaviors consistently, the cellular environment does respond. The biology isn't punishing us for imperfection. It's rewarding consistency over time, which brings me to something Dr. Miller emphasized in his public talks. He says the distinction between Healthspan optimization and what he calls the heroic intervention model.
What about that?
Well, the heroic intervention model is essentially the medical system's default approach to aging. You go to your doctor, you say, wow, I'm just feeling so fatigued and I don't have the energy I need. So they heroically intervene. Maybe it's a bypass surgery or a drug regimen or intensive physical therapy after a fall. And all those things can be important and maybe even life-saving, and we need to do them. But Dr. Miller's point is that we've overinvested in the heroic things and underinvested in daily maintenance behaviors that could have prevented these interventions in the first place. And Don, I'm thinking that as we've aged, we're getting to the point where we understand the importance of consistent behavioral, how we do things behaviorally consistently. I think that's something that with age can do better than maybe younger people who are maybe more impatient. Or at least I have a theory we could possibly be better.
You made me think about something I hadn't really thought of before, which is I mentioned previously my rotator cuff surgery. And if those of you that are familiar with it, that's considered to be one of the more painful surgeries there is. The recovery time is actually very significant, 3 to 6 months. And I know when I had that surgery last year, for about 4 months after I had the surgery, I really couldn't do much exercise at all. In fact, in the early weeks, I couldn't even get up out of the chair. And so because I had a heroic effort done to fix something that had been damaged for a very long time, it actually put me in a place where I couldn't consistently do the kind of things I needed to keep the rest of my body going, right? And so this is exactly the kind of trap we've been describing since the beginning of the episode. We treat health as something to be responded to with intensity rather than maintained, if possible, with consistency.
Well, and it's something we probably did all of our life, Don. We used to call it the weekend warrior. Maybe you've heard of that. It's like, what are you going to do this weekend? Oh, I'm going to hike Mount Everest or something like that, or going to bike 30 miles around the lake. Well, even then, we weren't really being consistent, but we're not really well served by that because the body's most powerful repair and maintenance system, they're all activated and sustained by regular, consistent, moderate lifestyle inputs. So I don't know how many times we're going to say that in this program, but I'm going to say it one more time. Regular, consistent, moderate lifestyle inputs.
So, David, neither you nor I are medical experts or body scientists of any kind, but one
For
thing we
sure.
know a fair amount about is psychology and about mental states and so on. I think it's important we need to take a look at that, not just psychology, not just physiology. If consistency genuinely outperforms intensity, then why do we keep choosing intensity? What's going on psychologically?
Well, I think it's a great and important question to ask, and I don't think we should rush past it because I don't think it's just a lack of information. I think there's something deeper about how we relate to our bodies and maybe to the concept of time as we get older. When we were younger, we had the luxury of feeling like we had a lot of time, infinite time. A bad year of health could be undone by maybe another good year. But as we age, you begin to feel that time is contracting. And there's a feeling of urgency that I need to fix this now before something really bad happens. And so it's sort of a grief response in disguise. Grief for the energy levels we remember, grief for the sense of physical invincibility that we didn't even notice when we had it. Don, I have to go to bed earlier these days. And sometimes I look back and think, oh my goodness, I'm almost embarrassed to tell my kids what time I go to bed sometimes because I remember when I could stay up and pull all-nighters doing work and things like that. But we responded with intensity back in those days. And today we have to respond with an effort proportional to what we've lost or what we fear losing.
So, as we age, we are looking for intense fitness challenges, radical diet changes, and supplement stacks to form a strategy, if you will, a health strategy for ourselves. But psychologically, what's really going on is it's a protest against aging itself. So, to get real, I mentioned previously here about my walking, hiking, and so on. And the other day I was feeling really guilty about this. So I went out one morning and walked for over an hour. I hadn't been walking in a while. I decided I'm going to go out. I'm going to go walk for an hour. Now, my normal walk is about 30 minutes. And I use a brisk walk. So it's actually pretty healthy for me, I think. But I was feeling guilty, so I went out for an hour, right? I felt better because I walked, but the hour, frankly, was too much for not having been out for a long while. So I found it easy not to walk again the next day because I was tired and because I justified to myself, well, I walked an hour yesterday. I protested and my body protested back.
The same thing happened to me a year ago. So we professors, summer is a little easier time for us to manage and we can go out and exercise and things like that. And so I started doing an early morning walk and then a later day walk, right? And, my goal was to hit 5 miles of walking. Well, you got to build up to that stuff. There was a time when, I could just do that. And honestly, I can still do it, but I pay a significant price if I do that, Don. So your body did protest back, and that's exactly what it is. And I'm not judging you or myself because that's what we do, but there's a cruel irony that in that protest, that intensity, because it actually did the opposite of what we hoped it would do. And it depletes us and it defeats us and it deepens our fear of aging.
And that connects back to what we've been talking about in our recent episodes, our need to move from a producer identity to something more essential, because the intensity model of health is fundamentally a producer model, isn't it? Okay. I'm going to produce results. I'm going to manufacture wellness through sheer effort and will. And the reality is, not only does it not generally work, but it can also be defeating.
So the garden or consistency model requires a different psychological posture. It's patient tending. You just patiently tend to yourself. You show up every day. You don't feel like you have to conquer anything, but just to care for something. And for a lot of us, that shift is genuinely hard. We think, well, really ramp it up, No, just put in the consistent effort. Here's a term that I like to use: trust the process. Dr. Benjamin Miller, I think he is teaching us something. Trust the process. You may feel like you need to really throw everything against it and really, fight the aging or whatever it is. It's genuinely hard, but you don't have to do that.
In reality, this consistency model we're talking about is the most sophisticated and effective thing we really can do.
It's a cultural dimension that we should talk about. We live in a culture that celebrates all these transformation stories, the dramatic before and after. We have TV shows that, show people, losing weight quickly and rising to the challenge and all that. It's the comeback narrative. And you hear about like 60-year-olds who run a marathon. And honestly, these are really inspiring stories, but they can also reinforce the idea that dramatic change is the only change worth celebrating, and that slow, steady, undramatic consistency is somehow less impressive and less worthy of our attention.
You and I love these transformation stories, don't we?
Oh, yeah.
In fact, at the core of our podcast is a belief that each of us can transform our thinking and our lives in positive ways as we age. But when it comes to our aging bodies, slow, steady, and undramatic consistency is actually where the real miracle is happening.
I really want us to think about the slow, steady, consistent thing. And by the way, there is some interesting, rather dramatic transformations we can make as we get age, and you just mentioned them. It's in our mind and way of looking at things and letting ourselves be transformed on the inside, maybe spiritually or physically, however you like to look at it. Those things can be radically transformed, but slow and steady wins the race on this. The tortoise and the hare is a real story, Don.
Hey, David, let's get practical. Because I think one of the risks of this conversation is that people might hear that consistency over intensity means that they just need to kind of dial everything back and not push themselves. But that's not really what we're saying, is it?
Not at all. Consistency doesn't mean low effort. It means sustainable effort that you apply regularly. So, Don, maybe we should talk about 5 areas where we can really make a difference by applying consistency. And these areas have been identified as movement, sleep, nutrition, stress, and connection.
So let's start with movement. I think it's where most people think of health first. Maybe nutrition may equal that, but it's very important, isn't it?
It sure is. And the research on movement and Healthspan is really consistent. 150 to 300 minutes of moderate intensity aerobic activity per week. And you combine that with a couple of sessions of resistance training, and that's usually your sweet spot if you're over 50. And this is all based on research. It's not an arbitrary thing that somebody says you ought to do, but it's something that researchers say will help activate the cellular repair you need.
The key term here to think of is moderate, right? Not maximal, not punishing. We want to elevate our heart rate with sustained effort, but not the kind of intensity that requires 2 days of recovery.
Absolutely right. And there's another dimension of movement that often gets overlooked in the intensity model. It's the daily non-exercise physical activity. Walking to check the mail, doing yard work, taking the stairs. These are low-grade, consistent movements throughout the day that are actually very profoundly important to you for your metabolic health and longevity. And they keep our systems from going into cellular dormancy.
So, okay, number two, let's talk about sleep because I think this is the most underrated factor in the health span conversation. Although I sleep reasonably well, I'd like to do better.
Me too. And it's dramatically underrated. And it's also the area where I think intensity shows up in an unusual way because a lot of people who are very health focused will push through on 5 or 6 hours of sleep because they prioritized an early workout or they're staying up late doing research on their next health protocol. And unknowingly, they're undermining the very goals they're working towards.
Why is sleep so central to health span specifically?
Well, first, when we sleep, the brain physically clears out the metabolic waste. Inadequate sleep allows those waste products, including proteins, which are associated with cognitive decline, to accumulate inside. And second, when sleep is when the body does all of its muscular repair work. So those senescent cells we were talking about earlier, the zombie cells, the immune system is most active in clearing them out during a deep sleep. And finally, sleep is where the hormones, which are necessary for muscle repair and maintenance, that's when all that happens, including your growth hormones, and it's its most favorite time to repair.
The person who skips sleep to do an intense workout is actually defeating themselves on two fronts.
7 to 9 hours of consistent quality sleep. It's not optional. It's part of your health span, focused life, and it's a foundation of it.
All right. So, what about nutrition? That was number three on our list because this is where I see the intensity trap play out most dramatically. People going from one extreme dietary protocol to another.
It's probably the most obvious area, and it's probably the one that most people think about, quite frankly. But the research on nutrition and longevity is also clear and a little bit boring, frankly, because you've heard it before, but here we go again. Whole foods, mostly plants, minimally processed, adequate protein, and you limit those ultra processed foods and excess sugars. And that's pretty much it. And that's what the evidence supports.
That's not what generally gets our attention, is it?
Consistency is kind of unsexy. It's what gets your attention is the carnivore diet, the prolonged fasting protocols, the latest longevity supplements, and those have an interesting place in the science behind them, but they're being pursued by people who haven't slept well in years. They eat ultra processed foods most of the time. And if you're doing that, it's just not going to help you.
It's important to get the foundations consistent first, just like exercise, right? And
Sure.
and then if you want to explore some more advanced protocols, you have a solid base for them to actually work.
Yeah, exactly. And this is something Dr. Miller also emphasized. He says the interventions that show the most promise in his research on biology work synergistically with a consistent lifestyle behavior. They're not substitutes for them, but they combined with them, they can be very powerful.
Make sure we don't leave out two things that I think are critically underappreciated in the health conversation, especially for men of our generation, and those are stress management and social connection.
And these have profound and documented health improvements on our health span. Chronic stress, and specifically the chronic elevation of cortisol, is one of the most accelerators of the aging process. And we've been discussing it, but stress really will ramp up those senescent cells. It impairs your mitochondrial function, it disrupts your sleep, it increases the inflammation in your body. Will age you. It ages us faster. We've always talked about how that person has aged under stress. It's really true.
This is where the intensity trap can be so damaging because the person doing an intense health overhaul while still running at high stress with poor sleep and social isolation is really, once again, working against themselves, against their own good.
And the body doesn't care. It doesn't distinguish between the stress of a high pressure work environment and the stress of an intense workout. Stress is stress to your nervous system. It impacts your nervous system in the same way. So this is why stress regulation, whether it's through mindfulness practice, time in nature, or meaningful leisure, or just therapies that we've discovered in previous episodes, it's not a soft or optional component of health span. It's really central and core to it.
Social connection?
Well, the research on social connection and longevity is some of the most compelling in all of aging science. Isolation is really a big risk factor. And believe it or not, it can hasten an early death. It's sort of like smoking 15 packs of cigarettes a day. That'd be a lot of cigarettes. But
It would be.
the point we're trying to make is when you are lonesome, when you're isolated, you don't have any social connections, it takes its toll on your life. Consistent, meaningful social connection is one of the most powerful things we can do for our health span. So it's not occasional intense activity, but consistent relationships that you can tend to. Once again, I use the garden metaphor.
David, as we start to bring this together, I want to address something that I think is a real challenge for a lot of our listeners. I know it is for me, because we can lay out all the evidence, we can describe all the practices, but making the shift from intensity-based relationship with health to a consistency-based one is fundamentally a mindset shift. Mindset shifts are difficult. At least I know they are for me, right?
Yeah, and they are for me too. And we don't want to be dismissive of the fact that they are difficult. And so maybe we could reframe it a few ways that can help. So, first, the cellular processes that we've been describing are happening at a scale we can't see or feel in the moment. When you take a 20-minute walk, it doesn't feel like you've done anything important. It was natural, it happened, and wasn't too stressful. But at the cellular level, if you could be in there, those guys are jumping up and clapping for you. You've just sent a significant maintenance signal to them and all the tissues of your body that it's time to do something to take out the trash. And so don't let the invisibility of the benefit diminish the reality of what's really going on.
Yeah, you mentioned this earlier that we need to trust the process. I love that phrase too. Trust the process, even when we can't see the results in the mirror. And that's not always easy, right? Because it's not visible, it's not quick, especially when most of us feel 15 in our heads, but the mirror definitely says otherwise.
And that's true. We do feel younger in our mind. It requires a kind of biological faith, a faith that the consistent, undramatic things are really doing important work, even when we can't see it happening. We can't look inside of ourselves and say, oh, yeah, this is going on. But you can trust that it is happening. And another thing that we might think about is that the all or nothing attitude. That's one of the more damaging ways that you could go about making changes. All or nothing. You're either doing the full program or you failed. If you haven't counted all the calories, then you failed. If you haven't done the 5-mile or run today, you've missed out. Missing a workout matters far less than whether your pattern over the months and years is regular, whether you have regular movement. So a week of bad eating matters far less at Christmas time than whether your normal dietary pattern over time is nourishing and having the vegetables and the protein and the non-processed foods and the elimination of sweets and so forth.
This is actually pretty liberating because it means a lapse isn't a failure. It's just a noise in the signal. You can return to the signal without drama. You don't have to necessarily feel like you've failed and so it's time to give up and so on. Once again, the goal is not perfection, but rather establishing the pattern of healthy behaviors.
Sure, and none of us are going to be perfect, but we can all consistently go. I've heard a thing, Don, that we're always headed in the right direction. Planes deviate from their flight patterns a little bit, but the destination is always the same. They get there. Without that shame spiral that often comes with the intensity model, man, we can do great things. No shame, no intensity, but just constant effort in the right direction. That's the most important thing. Shame and criticisms aren't going to get you where you need to be, but just consistent effort. Just start over again the next day. The person who beats themselves up for missing their 3 workouts is just adding more to their mind, and which is working against their health span.
Another reframe we want to look at is that maintenance is not surrender. I love this one, David, because I think this is the only one that really challenges our generation's worldview, because this is not the way we've been trained to think.
It was ingrained deeply in me to believe that maintenance is a lesser ambition than achievement. When someone comes up to you and says, I lost 75 pounds, you go, wow, what an amazing thing that you've done. But the person who is moving in that direction, taking whatever time it's going to take, but doing it in a slow and steady, consistent behavior, they're doing it too. They're keeping the garden alive. They're flourishing through the seasons of life. And it's actually going to get there. You're going to get what you need by doing those things.
Yeah, because you're maintaining doesn't because what you're maintaining isn't just your cardiovascular fitness or your muscle mass. You're actually maintaining your capacity to be present for your grandchildren, to travel with your partner, to do meaningful work, to be of service in your community. You are actually maintaining your health span.
If you view it through that lens, the person who faithfully walks their 3 miles a day for 20 years, who goes to bed consistently at an hour that they should, goes to bed for a consistent hour, who tends their friendships, who manages their stress, that person is doing something pretty extraordinary if you think about it. Even if they never posted it on social media, and even if they didn't get it logged in their watch, the app on their watch.
Before we close, David, I want to spend a moment on something practical because everything we've talked about today exists in relationship with the formal healthcare system. And I think a lot of people feel a tension between the consistency based approach we're describing and the way conventional medicine operates.
Sure, and that's an important tension that we have to talk about. The conventional medical system is, by design, oriented towards the heroic intervention we described earlier, and it's built to respond to disease, but it's not necessarily designed to optimize your health span. And that means a lot of us, what we've been talking about today, isn't something your doctor's going to prescribe to you. They might mention it to you in passing and say you might want to do something, but they're not teaching you how to do it.
Which doesn't mean it's not the most important work you can be doing.
Sure, exactly. What we want to encourage our listeners to do is to approach their healthcare relationships with the health span mindset. Ask your doctor not just what's wrong, but what can I do consistently to extend my good years of health? And seek out providers who are oriented towards preventative and functional medicine. And advocate for the monitoring tools that track health span markers, things like inflammatory markers, metabolic panels, bone density, cognitive baseline assessments, and not just crisis indicators.
If you're working with a physician who's oriented toward the reactive model, it's worth having a direct conversation about your interest in a more proactive approach. That conversation is entirely reasonable and increasingly supported by the evidence base. David, I do feel a need to say that every physician's recording when you call them says if you're having a medical emergency, hang up and dial 911. I'm sure we've all
Does.
heard that, right?
Mm-hmm.
There are real medical crises, and they can be a part of aging no matter how much we tend to our health span. So, what we're not saying is that intensity of action is never called for because we believe that consistent efforts improve our health span will potentially reduce the number of intensive responses in our aging bodies. But nevertheless, there are real crises, and we do need to respond to those.
Sure, yeah. Donna and I are very pro health, pro seeing your doctor, and if you have a crisis, go take care of it. But Dr. Miller and other researchers in the aging biology space are actually making a compelling case to the medical community and to all of us that the return on investment, if that's what you're looking for, the return on investment for health span focused interventions is enormous, much greater than the cost of treating diseases that result when you neglect them. So this is the shift that's beginning to get a little traction in the field.
David, as we wrap up, I want to come back to something you said near the beginning. For many of us, the intensity model of health is really a protest against aging. And I've been sitting with that. I think for a long time, I related to my health the way I related to a lot of things as a problem to be solved, a challenge to be conquered. And that worked well enough when I was younger, when the body was more forgiving. But what we're talking about today is fundamentally a different relationship. It's learning to be with the body rather than trying to manage it from the outside.
Sure, yeah, that's exactly what we're saying. It's beautifully said. And I think that what the health span science is really pointing us towards is not just a different set of behaviors, but a different relationship with ourselves as we age. And that's characterized by patience, consistency, self compassion, and the willingness to tend the garden every day, even when nothing dramatic seems to be happening.
Because at the cellular level, everything is happening.
That's exactly right. Researchers like Dr. Benjamin Miller are giving us a window into the invisible world and showing us the quiet, consistent choices we make every single day are having real, measurable biological effects. That consistency is not a consolation prize for people who can't do intensity. It's the sophisticated strategy of people who understand what aging actually requires.
What aging actually offers if we meet it with the right relationship.
That's the fifth season. That's the fifth season we've been talking about, isn't it? Not a season of decline, but a season of wisdom, a season where we stop fighting the garden and start tending to the garden.
Thank you for spending time with us this week. If today's conversation sparked something for you, we'd love to hear about it. What is one consistency-based health practice you're going to recommit to this week? Share it with us.
If you haven't already, please subscribe to the fifth season wherever you get your podcast and share the episode with someone in your life who might be caught in the intensity trap. And as always, Don and I believe that aging is a privilege. Our job is to do it well. And we'll see you next week.
Take care of yourselves and tend to your garden.